Okay, everyone, let's start. Welcome to the final webinar of the DRM certificate course. We're almost there. I know the exam's coming up next month, and hope you're enjoying the course so far. So let's kick off. I'm Sophie Brock. We've met before. You can see where we are. The end is in sight. Hope that you guys are finding the discussion forum helpful, as well as obviously all the materials that you have. Just a quick overview of what we're going to discuss today. We're going to run through the highlights of units 5 and 6. I know we covered 1 to 4 previously, and talk a little bit about revision techniques and tips, the exam itself, structure, and some ideas about technique. And of course, how I can best help you, how I can best assist you. So let's kick off straight away and jump straight into Unit 5, which of course is dealing with attacks, defence and risk-based approaches. Of course, as highlighted here, we need to be familiar with the evolving nature of both attack and defence mechanisms, be able to explain and describe defence methods and frameworks and how those are set up, again with the evolving nature of those constantly in mind. It's quite intrinsic, I think, to everything that we're learning about these issues, that it's constantly something that's constantly changing, and needs a constantly updated response. And so I think that comes through in quite many interesting ways in the course materials and of course in the case studies and so on. We cover, of course, the main threat actors, their motivations, their capabilities, and how those are sort of ranked in terms of risk impact, which we'll cover a little bit later. And of course, assessment and the 6-step approach to digital risk management. So let's get going. So you'll be familiar by now with the UK government-backed framework, the Cyber Essentials framework. It's one of many designed to help businesses, particularly small and medium enterprises, create better defences. And of course, it covers all the mechanisms that you guys will be familiar with from Unit 5, so firewalls, security in terms of configuration, access control, malware, virus protection, so on, and timely patch management. So interesting, because these 5 defences, and they're covered obviously in detail in chapter 9 of the cybersecurity textbook, and we can go into quite a bit of detail about those. Again, ensure that you can not just describe them but give use cases and show them in action. And the point is that the UK Cyber Essentials scheme states that effective management of those 5 key areas will guard against 80% of potential attacks. So excuse my voice, please. The figures are really dramatic. Cybercrime, the fastest growing industry on the planet. And you can see this figure here from World Economic Forum is a few years old now, but estimated revenue $445 billion. And you can imagine that's only gone up in the past 4 years, and no doubt still rising. So I've given just one example here of one sort of defence method. Of course, there are many described in detail, and familiarise yourselves with them. But mobile device management is a good one, I think. Technology, of course, to securely control the operation and use of devices, and lets you do things like remotely wipe control which apps can be installed and so on. And it's just one piece in the puzzle, really, of a defence framework. So again, chapter 9 of your cybersecurity textbook deals with this in detail, but do ensure that you're familiar with methods such as the honeypot, obviously something that's designed to look like something that contains information of value, but in fact contains tools to identify and trace any intrusions. And that's, of course, just one of many devices or instruments to counteract attempts unauthorized use of information systems. Also multi-factor authentication, again a really key asset here, usually requiring 3 categories of proof of ID. And I'm sure we're all familiar with these from just our day-to-day interaction with services and so on. I've put here, just so you've got them in one place, some key terms, again, to be familiar with and be able to sort of offer and describe use cases for them. Again, for ease of reference here, the 14-point framework for defence. Think about which step or which factor is the most important and sort of has an impact on the extent to which all the others can stand. This Sony case study from back in 2014 is of course discussed and described at length in the course materials. Be familiar with it, and of course the key factors, which I've summarised for you a little bit later, but it's a really good example of polymorphic malware in action. And as a patriotic and good Greek, I am obliged to tell you, polymorphic, poly means many and morphic means shapes or forms. So of course we're talking about malware that can mutate to circumvent anti-malware software and any existing defences. So in that case, be familiar with, of course, the key factors, the threat actor, the root causes. I have summarised here for you some of the key learnings from that case study, in which arguably there's no single point of accountability, but lots of sort of layers or factors that together led to vulnerability. And I think it's helpful to have this list because you'll probably see that in the many similar case studies that have appeared in the news since, and even very recently, you'll see that these factors seem to repeat time and again. So moving on, as I mentioned earlier, we need to know who the main threat actors are, and you can see from this table the interplay really between the motivation and the capability, and those are indexed to combine those 2 factors in terms of how big a risk they pose. I was quite surprised to see this figure of 74% of attacks coming from disaffected or opportunistic insiders. It was quite surprising to me. But again, I would urge you to look at this and try to give it a bit of context. So maybe in terms of your own organisations, what the threatscape is as you perceive it and why. Ideas around white hats and black hats, so ethical versus malicious hackers, whether where people tend to draw the line and so on. Everything from terrorism on the one hand to hacking to promote a political agenda. Interested to hear where you guys sit on your thoughts on that spectrum. This ties in pretty neatly with chapter 11 of the MoAssert text, so feel free to refer to that for more detailed explanation. Here you've got just some of the models for digital risk management, for capturing and reporting risk, and of course for measuring and monitoring a system for control of that risk. So we've got the 4 T's that we've covered previously back in Unit 2, the steps to identify, evaluate, prioritise and manage, and so on, and the typical cybersecurity approach, which we talked about in our last webinar, I believe it was, when we talked about the highlights of Unit 4. So again, just to make sure that you can explain all of those and give them some context as well. Set out here the 3 key ingredients, as they're referred to, of cyber risk frameworks. So thinking about who's accountable, thinking about the life cycle of a risk and how it's dealt with from being identified and then and closed off in some way. and how we assess risk information and what we do with it. So again, just giving a little bit of context, does your organisation have a cyber risk register? How's that set up, and so on? And again, I've just put a note on that slide to refer you to the relevant chapter of the course materials, so that it's easy for you guys to reference between one and the other. Set out here the ways to treat a risk, and taking a step back, the analysis. So the formula, or if you like, is the risk likelihood multiplied by the risk impact, and that gives you what we call the risk product. And having it set out in that formula, of course, enables like-for-like comparisons and enables decisions to be made about strategies in terms of risk appetite and so on. So whether companies choose to prevent the risk entirely through avoidance, find ways to reduce the risk, mitigate the risk, whether it's a risk that can be tolerated or accepted, contingency plans, and of course transferring usually by insurance policies. So again, think about the different types of risks, and of course you've got many case studies and examples in your course materials, but again in your own experiences or in your own organisations, how those are dealt with, and where on the spectrum they fall, I suppose, in terms of risk product. Here I've set out for you the 6-step risk-based approach to cybersecurity management. Again, many details to supplement these descriptions in the materials, but just to take you through to identify the highest value information targets first, and of course prioritize the protection that's given to those, and verify the business case for how and where the key information is needed, all the way through to considering the threats as a whole, the threatscape, and minimizing the footprint of any sensitive data. And of course, taking all that into account, then adding the appropriate security controls, whatever those might be in the circumstances. That was a very quick run through Unit 5, and onto Unit 6, risk-based cybersecurity, change management, exposure and response. So taking you through just really briefly, I'm sure you're all familiar with this by now, but the alignment of governance, business objectives and digital risk, and we'll come on to that shortly, and just being able to have a good overview of change management and how that should be dealt with, what the best practice approaches are, including incident management and reporting, and emerging risks. Here we've got the OECD principles of governance, and I think that this is fairly self-explanatory, but it just makes for sort of a uniform approach in governance, and I think that we see from the case studies that that's really important. We can talk in quite a bit of detail about the risks that can be created through change. I've mentioned here the cyber attack on the NHS in the UK a couple of years ago now, the WannaCry. I'm sure you all remember seeing the news coverage, but that's a really good example of illustrating the need for change management policy, and a robust one. And in that case, what was quite shocking was that there was a warnings were issued by an external provider about applying a patch, and reportedly were not heeded by any of the 80 organisations that were affected by that particular attack. So obviously the various risks that can be created are loss of service, loss of data, theft of data, weakened security and reputational damage, and companies need to, of course, have a clear policy in terms of how to manage those risks, and also what fallback options they've got. So business recovery or business continuity plans that, let's say, a software company must have in place to give its its customers some comfort in advance, you know, when you're subscribing for a service, to know what will happen if any of these things do occur. Again, think about your own organisations. What are your contingency plans or backup plans, and how have those been designed? In terms of change management here, we are we're looking at the various factors and the various angles from which it needs to be approached. And I think the overwhelming theme here is engaging on an individual level. I don't know if you agree, but that's the kind of overriding impression that I've got from looking at the materials, is that, you know, things like speaking to individuals as well as the company as a whole, and addressing the human side of change systematically, and taking into account the fact that human errors do occur, and the fact that individual employees or indeed consultants have varying degrees of A, awareness, and B, sort of integrity in these conditions, and you know, you have a range of levels of responsibility, and again, that can impact on how people engage with a policy and how much attention they pay. Just skipping on, you've got the best practice approaches set out in full detail in chapter 13. And again, I think give some thought to how your own environment compares, and how it complies, or to what extent it complies. And again, with these factors in mind, I think just looking at recent examples in the news and so on of situations that have arisen from perhaps not complying with these. Things like security training for employees and suppliers, things like authorised access of employees to certain information, and limiting that, for example, to specific people in specific circumstances, carrying out only a very limited range of tasks. And again, it's a case of, I think, my view is keeping these things under review and treating them as something that's fluid and that's alive in a way, and changing all the time. So keeping it constantly under review. Let's say, you know, does this set of employees or group of employees still require access to information that we gave them access to 6 months ago to carry out a certain task, or has that task been completed, and should we now remove that access? And it's just I think a case of having a policy and keeping it up to date, and staying on top of all these sorts of factors, both looking back and learning from anything that, you know, any breaches, etc., that have occurred, and looking forward and anticipating new risks or evolving risks. So again, might be worth considering in your own experience or in your own organisations examples of those. And again, just giving thought to the practicality. So here you've got an example on this list, number 5, do any key systems or applications updates and so on for on weekdays or not? How do individuals feel about the working environment and so on? Because all of these factors, some are less tangible than others, but I think they all do contribute to a business's vulnerability or not. You've got the UK National Archives Information Asset Register guidance here in terms of increasing efficiency and identifying potential risk areas. So best practices here are, of course, listing an organisation's assets and identifying which ones are key, which ones are crucial for effective functioning, which ones can we not live without, can we not function without. Describing those assets and identifying the owners, and deciding really upon who's going to ensure that risks are monitored, and making sure that you know, responsibility is divided in a transparent way. We cover, of course, incident management and reporting. So security incident event management covering from both sides, so the detective controls, looking for problems, and corrective controls, reducing problems. And again, in reality, just thinking about the spectrum on which these issues can occur, and in terms of timeframes, and whether one needs to look back or indeed look forwards, or ideally both. So again, what controls does your organisation have? What use cases or case studies can we point to that really demonstrate these issues in a real and tangible way? I've listed here the 5 stages of incident management reporting process, from detection and reporting, verification, isolation, cleaning, and review, detect, respond, and recover. And Lockheed Martin offer this sort of flow chart of the stages of a cyber attack that an intruder might go through. Again, I'm sure you're familiar with this from the course materials, but it's a pretty common pattern. And again, if you refer to the case studies, even stories that we've seen reported in the news recently, you'll often see this exact pattern played out. And here we've got what's referred to as the cyber kill chain, and effective way to deal with these issues as and when they do arise. We talked before about emerging risks, and what's creating those: more information and access to more information, same for processing power, and also just the simple fact of a greater number of smaller devices, Internet of Things, which we'll come on to on the next slide, and augmented reality. All these sorts of things create emerging threats. And like we said, Internet of Things, this is a particular sort of area or scope of vulnerability that comes about because of these key factors of things, not easily patched, a longer life cycle, outside of an enterprise's security perimeters, and therefore not necessarily subject to the same protection as other objects or other devices, and so on. And again, it's worth giving some thought to how these factors, when they appear a few concurrently, what additional vulnerabilities are created and how those are best dealt with. So that was a very, very quick run through of the highlights, and I wanted to spend a bit of time on talking about revision techniques. Just a few tips from me that I've found have worked over the years. Planning, planning, planning. Don't do too much of the same thing for too long. Take regular breaks. It just allows you, I think, to sort of refresh and consolidate. I personally like to sort of change locations, move around in terms of different topics and different types of study, and I find that you sort of somehow somehow connect the things that you learn with if you were in a different place than usual at the time that you studied them, and there seems to be, some link there that helps anyway with triggering recall somehow. Don't multitask, don't be checking phones and things. Just shut yourself away if that works for you. Works for me. Take good notes, collaborate. We talked already about the student discussion forum, and please do make the most of it. Feel free to share anything you think helpful, to raise questions, to get people's views. It can be a really good place to sort of kick off discussions and bounce ideas around and so on. Spaced learning is, I think, a really, really effective way to work, and making sure, like I said, to take regular breaks. I always find I can't concentrate on anything deeply for more than 20-25 minutes or so, and I find that this method works really well. Input and then break and then recall, so whether testing yourself or writing your own notes later, and then applying the information separately, I think is really good method for sort of consolidating what you're learning and what you're taking in. You've got your specimen examples, of course your study guide, your notes, make a plan, map out the remaining time that you've got between now and December, what you want to cover, and of course, like I said, test yourself. It really does help. Practice the exam type questions, practice the multiple choice, practice the case study questions. Practice makes perfect. You've had this in the previous slides, but I've put it here just because I think it's helpful for cross-referencing. You can see then how everything fits together and where the key points are covered in your materials. Your essential reading, of course, and your additional reading and study guide. And again, when you are going through your own notes or whatever it might be, I think it's really helpful to, like I've been saying all the way through, really apply the principles to real life and give use cases and talk them through, explain things out loud at the risk of seeming a bit bonkers. Ask yourself questions, pretend like you're explaining it to someone else, use the discussion forum and so on. You've got specimen exam questions, flashcards if this is your thing, testing yourself under exam conditions. This is just a summary really of all the things we've talked about in terms of techniques. So the section B statement questions, just to ensure that you're clear on the mechanism of how those work. Leave yourself enough time for section C, which is the case studies that need some reading time in the exam. And goes without saying, read the exam questions carefully and so on. I always find that this principle forces me to go back and examine exactly what I can and cannot explain. So just coming on to exam technique in a little bit more detail and the exam setup. It's 60 questions, 90 minutes. As you know, divided into 3 sections. The first is the sort of straightforward, the standard multiple choice with 3 options. Section B is the assertion and reason, so the linked statement questions that we've seen before, and section C is the case studies, which of course will require extra reading time. And in these slides, I've just set out a few examples of the types of questions and how those are structured. Excuse me. And again, the different sort of structure options for the MCQs, statement questions, linked statement questions. We looked at these before. I think it was in the first webinar we looked at these together, but anyway, just so that you've got an example to hand, and you must obviously be able to explain how the 2 statements fit together, if indeed they do fit together, or explain one another. You've got another example here. I'll leave you to work through those in your own time. An example of a case study here as well. So again, probably most valuable to you is if you look at those in your own time. And so next steps: prepare, revise, practice, test, enjoy, and good luck. Please do be in touch via the discussion forum if there are particular points that you want help on, if there are particular questions that you want answered, resources and so on. And let me know. We've got plenty of time left if anybody's got any questions. And otherwise, that's it from me. I'll just leave it another couple of minutes in case any other questions come through. Somebody's asking about lockdown and the impact on the exam. Those practicalities, I suggest you discuss directly with the IRM, because I don't know for sure how the setup's going to work. But if you contact the student support at the IRM. I'm sure that they will guide you on that. I hope the webinar's been helpful. I hope it's been useful. I always like to err on the side of the more succinct and rather than read materials to you. So I hope it's been of use. I'm just checking for any more questions. I think we've covered all of these. I'll give it another minute. A couple more practical questions coming through about the exam itself, whether it's paper-based and so on. Again, I would take those questions directly to your student support at the IRM, anything about the sort of practicalities of the exam, because I don't have all of the information to hand. Okay, I think that's all. Thank you so much, everybody, and good luck. Thank you.